This is an 11 Alive Voices for Equality special, Stories of Resilience.
I hope those who are joining us recognize that as we discuss these topics that are important to the API community, it's the type of not only support, but being an ally, which I think is very important. And I'm honored and privileged to introduce the panel, and we'll get started with some questions. Joining us first and foremost is Sophia Choi, anchor, reporter, award winning journalist, Dr. Gulshan Harji, who is the co founder of Clarkston Community Health Center, Monica Khan, Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We have Phi Nguyen, who is with our Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta. And finally, the Honorable Judge Alvin T. Wong, who is with our DeKalb County State Court. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Let's talk about representation. Is API representation, and we talked a little about that, important in your profession and why?
Oh, I think it's very important in my field, which is strictly healthcare for the most part. I think it's very important to have AAPI representation. And the reason is because healthcare is unique in that it has to be ethnically, linguistically, and culturally very sensitive. And so at the bedside, it becomes even more important. And for a patient of an ethnic community to be able to speak about, say, their mental health or violence at home, there has to be some connection. And so from that standpoint, I have only a couple of suggestions. One is that we need more AAPI representation in the medical schools, in the healthcare educational facets. I think the other thing is that, and we will, I'm sure, touch this later, is that healthcare is very unique and that it is a right. And unless we have advocacy that focuses on the needs of healthcare of the AAPI population, we may not make much progress. So I think we need legislators that are of AAPI background who can advocate on our behalf. And I'm sure that this may also come back later in that the immigration issues are very, very important, and we need AAPI representation to create some changes for us.
What are some of the resources and sources that anyone in our community can leverage to be aware of what's going on in the API community, to be allies, to be advocates, to be supporters?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for also uplifting the increased wave of anti-Asian violence that we've seen over the last few years. First, I actually think it's important for people to know that there are multiple forms of violence against APIs, not just the highly visible deaths and physical attacks that we hear about on the street or read about in the news. Anti-Asian violence also includes violence that's not visible or that maybe is not interpersonal or that may not even solely be rooted in hate. Anti-Asian violence also includes systemic violence, structural violence, and state violence, including things like incarceration and deportation. And along those lines, I will never forget that the day before the Atlanta spa shootings last March, we were in the process of grieving the deportation of 33 Vietnamese refugees back to the country that they fled many years ago, before we quickly had to pivot to respond to another type of devastating violence that was afflicting our community. In terms of resources, there's no shortage of organizations and advocates who are good resources for understanding how violence affects API communities.
I'm so glad that Phi also mentioned it because it's a population that we don't openly discuss and gets lost in the narrative. And so, as you mentioned, the data points and the increase in AAPI hate, I just also want to say that we have a history in the United States of AAPI hate that goes back centuries. And while, from starting from when the Chinese migrant workers came to help with the railroad, construction, 3 centuries ago. And so since then, whether it's been, Muslim hate, whether it's been after 9/11, whether it's been, Southeast Asian hate or Asian hate, there has always, been that history in the United States for that. And so while now, because of the pandemic and because, we're now hearing about it in the news, there is an increase in focus and there are more reportings with it. So the data is showing that. But as you mentioned before, there are so many cases that are unreported. So in terms of resources, I have to say I've been doing this work for 25 years. And I'm really grateful to see organizations that Fee has mentioned and others. We all hear about Stop AAPI Hate, which always talks about the latest data points. If you want to know, what is happening, we see it in mainstream news a lot more than we used to.
How do you encourage others to be positive, and just kind of endure in the face of that type of anti-Asian hate and sentiment?
The type of sort of anti-Asian discrimination, I guess, that I have faced in my life tends to be actually mostly from, well, it's either strangers on the street or it's friends and colleagues who make jokes about names or other things. And I used to work in a predominantly white profession. I was a medical malpractice defense attorney. And so I was oftentimes the only Asian American and the only Asian American woman in a lot of the spaces I occupy. I was in Judge Wong's courtroom a few times, and I was very happy to be in a courtroom with an Asian judge. But let me just tell you, that was a very rare experience. But yeah, so there's a lot of like learning to just laugh off things that are microaggressions, because these are people who don't intend harm, but obviously it does harm you. You just internalize it and it can grow and fester. And then, the other ways that I've experienced it, I think, a long time ago and even more recently, is just weird comments on the streets, street harassment. It happened pretty recently when I was walking back from voting, actually close to my house, and somebody was like, "Hey, me love you long time," or something like that. And I was like, really? This was like last year. I had not heard that since I was like a child, in terms of being in spaces where there are other advocates and people who are fighting not just against discrimination and racism towards Asian Americans, but against all communities of color. That gives me hope. And it also gives me hope and optimism to see what Black communities, Latinx community, Asian American communities, and all these other communities who are impacted by racism are able to build, and the joy that we're still able to have, and the cultural practices that we still enjoy, like gathering around food, as everybody mentioned in the beginning.
With the second generation, our voices get louder, because I'll tell you one thing that really bothers me. We get cut out of a lot of opportunities. There are so many programs out there that help minorities, but we're always cut out. It's for Blacks, it's for Hispanics. They never mention Asians. And I wonder why. We're a community just like any other community. There are people who are very wealthy and there are people who really need help. Why are those people who are really needing help not getting the same opportunities as other minorities?
Thank you all for your courage and vulnerability and sharing so many of those painful experiences.
Alive's Chesley McNeil.
Crash, my man.
Starting his forecast.
Morning.
Before you get up. Helping you start the day prepared. Accurate. Worthy of your trust. Part of the 11 Alive Storm Trackers. making sure you and your family are safe when conditions become severe.
5 minutes out, Justin.
Chesley, you're next. 3, 2, 1.
Well, here's your forecast for today, folks. We're looking at some heavy rain.
Weekdays on 11 Alive Morning News.